YouTube.
And YouTube. And welcome everybody. With little technical difficulties. I think it seems a little more challenging these days to get some of these technologies up and running, but looks like we're doing it, and happy to be here. And welcome again to the Resonance Academy's 6 weeks of overview of the Unified Science program that we have made available for anybody to go through for free. And my name is Marshall Lefferts, and as maybe most of you know, but some of you are new here, I'm a member of the faculty of the Resonance Academy and a board member of Resonance Science Foundation. And we're going through the 6 modules of the Unified Science course that is available at the Resonance Academy. And you go to resonancescience.org. And I'm here today with Nassim Haramein, who is RSF's founder and director of research. And as well today, we're joined by Olivier Alirol, who is a research scientist working with Nassim on really absolutely groundbreaking theoretical developments of based on the holographic mass solution, which is the foundation of Nassim's theory. So before we have an intro from you guys, I just wanted to say, again, this is a 6-week series that's being offered to provide an introduction to the course, and for Nassim and Olivier today and myself to share about the subjects of each of the 6 modules of the course. We're going through one per week, and this is the 3rd week. And we're excited to say that we have over 6,000 people that have signed up for this series, the 6-week series, and over 18,000 people have signed up for the course. And that's just super exciting for us. And today we're going to share an overview of module 3 of the course, which is called Modern Physics. And we'll dive into that in a moment. But before we go there, I just wanted to welcome Nassim to the webinar and have you say a quick hello, and then I can make a little intro into what the module covers, Nassim, and we can take it from there. And later on, we'll take some Q&A from you guys as well. So Nassim, welcome.
Hi, thank you. It's great to be here with you. Today is gonna be fun. Marshall, you look like you're like in a wormhole.
I am.
Behind you, it's like a square wormhole. It's kind of cool.
Yes, it's very one of a kind.
Yeah, one of the yeah, exactly. It's a magic mirror. So we're gonna tentatively approach the reputable and formidable module 3, you know, which is the place where many people kind of like trip over physics, and you know, some people find it challenging, and I think it's really exciting because it really I believe personally that people find it challenging because we are in that module discussing the history of science, the history of physics mostly, but you know, and some of the approaches that have been taken in physics, the assumptions that were made, and some of the dissonance of the standard approach to physics, you know, which is normal. It's okay. We evolve as we evolve, and we grow as we grow, and it's really important for us to understand where we're coming from, to understand where we want to go and where we're going. And that was the concept of that module, was that the student would get at least a minimum base education on some of the big parts of the standard physics theories that are out there, but as well some of the not so well known or not so well understood history of physics. And it's great to have Olivier with us for that part. And you know, the history of science is not so well understood. And I'm talking about not only it's not so well understood, even people have majored and written books about the history of physics, like physics historians. Um, you find in many of those writings, either their papers or their books, that they didn't quite understand the physics that were developed, or the context in which the physics were developed, meaning that um, you know, typically the historical uh, context is overlooked. The the cultural context is overlooked. The pressures that were felt at certain stages of our evolution by physicists to, you know, go in a certain direction or in another, due to cultural context, due to historical context, due to societal pressure and financial pressure and all kinds of things that made physics evolve a certain way. And in order to understand that, you have to have very deep understanding of the physics themselves. And although people may think that you know, a physicist, first of all, physics is a very wide field. There's, you know, from astrophysics to, you know, quantum theory, relativity, like you know, astronomy. I mean, like there's a lot in physics, but as well, you know, so and there's many specialized parts of physics that don't communicate well one with each other. Um, there's as well a loss of knowledge that's occurring from generation to generation, which is causing some issues. For instance, uh, the general public might think that an astrophysicist understand Einstein field equations well, understand relativity well, and that relativity is well understood, not only in terms of people understanding it, but as well in terms of, you know, describing in details many components like mostly gravity and electromagnetic fields. And the same for quantum theory. You might think that quantum theory is well understood, that, you know, it's consistent, you know, quantum theorists understand all of the branches of quantum theory and so on in details. That's just not the case, because there is such a compartmentalization in our physics. You know, most physicists understand very specific things very well, and typically not the rest very well at all. So you can imagine that in the context of understanding the history of physics, you know, it's even a larger problem, because now you got to not only understand the various theories and the details of them, but you got to understand them in the context in which they were conceived of and how they were brought about. So for instance, it's very, very difficult to find physicists that have a very in-depth comprehension of relativity, from one end to the other, and that's comfortable with all of its aspects, or somebody that has a very deep understanding of quantum theory, and you know, that can go from quantum field theory to, you know, string theory, or, you know, the standard model of particle physics and so on, in one big swoop, and, you know, understand the deep level of details and their historical context in which they were built. So We tried in module 3. I know this has been a long-winded introduction. We tried in module 3 to really give you just like, and although people feel like, oh my God, I just hit a brick wall with all these physics and details, we really tried to give you an overview of the historical context in which these theories were built, namely mostly the two prevalent theories, or mechanics as well, the three prevalent theories that makes up our world of physics, and where they got those ideas, how did they got to where they are in those ideas, and the disconnected, kind of like confusing result that comes out of it, and I say that frankly, that doesn't just confuse the public, that confuses the physicists as well. And this is why, and more than ever now, like 20 years ago, looking for a unified field theory was thought to be not necessary. And if you were working on it, or I would say more like 25 years ago, 30 years ago, it was thought to be arrogant, because if Einstein couldn't find a unified field theory, how could you even imagine you would? But now it's like there's a huge push to try to find, something much more comprehensive. And that's because the new generation of physicists, like my friend over here, right, are kind of tired. They're just not gonna go along with like just calculate and don't think about it. They want to understand. They want to understand well. They can see that there's huge gaping holes in the standard approach that is leaving more questions than answers, and they want to push past all this. And so there is a very big push now for unifying physics. And Olivier and I, in the last few months, have completed the holographic mass solution to all of the fields and all of the scales. So we're very confident that we've done that, and we're excited to bring that to the world. But let's look at module 3.
Great, thanks, Nassim. Great introduction. Yeah, this is very foundational, not only to understanding the historical context and the current primary concepts and theories that are underpinning physics, but as well, there are aspects of this that really are important to understand when it comes to then learning about the unified physics model, the holographic mass solution, and understanding how it's in direct relationship to some of the current theories that are correct and accurate, and then are extended by unified physics theory. So it's really a very foundational aspect, and it can be a little challenging. I'll share my screen and we can take a quick look, if you want, at
yeah,
is in module 3.
Okay.
And here we go. I'm going to get these Zoom windows out of the way so I can see what I'm looking at. Yeah, so here's module 3, modern physics. And I want to just remind everybody again, this is not a class in module 3. This is an introduction, and it's not a requirement that you've studied module 3 to be in this session with us today. Take your time, especially this one there's a lot of information, and it goes very deeply into some subjects. And it's important foundationally, as I said. So after the introduction of setting the context of why to go into this review of modern physics, the first section is covering the overall concept of reductionism as an approach to problem solving in science and in physics in particular, and reviewing Descartes and Newton and his contention to Cartesian thinking, the idea of a flat universe, etc., laying that foundation of the reductionist approach and how that's informed and in some ways challenged our capacity to really go deeper into the physics. Then a study in the idea, again, another fundamental premise of science, especially in physics, is the idea of the closed system, which Nassim talked about quite a bit last week as well, and how that relates to energy, the laws of thermodynamics, entropy, etc. And then a overview and review of Einstein and the relativity revolution. And so the nature of light and special relativity, the mass energy equivalence of E equals mc squared, gravity and Einstein's general theory of relativity, black holes. This is very foundational stuff, actually, to understanding the unified physics model as well. And just to note, it's not that this gets super technical in this module. It can, in some instances, go there, but it's meant to be more to provide the overall conceptual understanding. And then the last section is on quantum theory. What does quantum mean? Black body radiation and the ultraviolet catastrophe, which is a kind of what originated the understanding of the quantum aspect of the universe. The Planck units, this is very important to understand in relationship then to how that applies to unified physics theory. The birth of quantum theory, the Copenhagen interpretation, which I know Nassim and Olivier may comment on that as to how that in some ways constrained the thinking over the past 100 or so years in physics that maybe caused a little more challenge than it needed to. And then quantum electrodynamics and quantum field theory and the vacuum catastrophe, etc. And then a look at the standard model. And there's many aspects of it here. I won't read them all again. So that's the main topics of this module. As you can see, it really covers a lot of ground, and it's very important to understand the premise, the theory of modern physics, how it has informed and successfully informed the pursuit of physics and the understanding of the nature of the physical aspects of the universe, as well as the ways in which it has essentially kind of gone off in directions that have posed more challenges because they aren't necessarily going to answer the questions. They're some of the big questions that until now have not been able to be answered because this model had its limitations built into it, and which Nassim and Olivier can talk to about how that's so, as well as how some of those and many of those big questions are being answered through the unified physics model. So that's the overview. And
yeah, and we have William Brown online as well, I think.
Did William join us? Oh, great.
Yeah. So William can pick some questions as well. Hi, William.
Sharing. You there, William?
Yes, I'm here. I'm just here, I guess, to offer any kind of support.
Okay.
We discuss some of these topics.
I appreciate to have you there.
For all the questions we can't answer, we always throw them to William.
Yeah, exactly.
Always here as a fallback.
So just throw William under the bus.
Yeah. Nassim, I saw one message that some people said it was a little hard to hear you. I don't know if you want to pull your computer a little closer to you.
Oh, okay.
But just be aware of that, and maybe you and Olivier can speak up a little bit.
Okay. Alors, tu veux que je change?
C'est le premier.
Celui-là. Tout en haut.
Is this better? Can you hear me better now?
Oh, yeah, it sounds better to me. I didn't even realize that was your voice. I thought somebody else.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems to be a lot more present and clear. Great.
Okay, great.
So, yeah, I would say, Nassim, a good place to start is that this module is intended to provide both a foundation of understanding that is then useful and necessary to go into the unified physics in module 4, sure, as well as to highlight some of the problems in modern physics that are really persisting to pose challenges in the ability to solve solve problems and understand, greater, more so the nature of the universe. And so, do you want to just begin by talking a little bit about that aspect of the importance of this module?
Yeah. So basically, these principles that were developed early on have a lot of merit. They have got us to where we are, and they allow us to do very important calculations. For instance, for planes to fly, for your cars to work, for your phones to work, for all kinds of things we do, and they're important. Some of the aspects we're going to discuss today is that, however, it has reached limitations, and it's reached these limitations because in some cases we've made models, but then forgot that we made a model. So we came to conclusions from these models and assumed that this is truly how the universe works, where in fact, it's the answer we're getting from the theory is only based on the fundamental axioms or these models that we set on our way to developing the theory. And because the reason why it's not so obvious to physicists is because the models might have been created by somebody else almost 100 years ago. The theory had hundreds of people, if not thousands of people, contribute pieces of it, along the way. And so it's like the root, the root BIOS of a computer, that's buried under, thousands of plugins. If people remember the problem of Y2K, where mainframe computers of banks and governments and all this were running a root directory or a root software that had a problem with spinning out dates past 2000. But there was some serious issue to go in there and edit it because it was under, I don't know how many updates of codes and plugins and all kinds of stuff on top of it. And actually accessing the root software was, very complex and almost impossible in some cases. And so it was eventually done properly by most of the banks. My cousin actually helped out with one of them, Morgan Stanley. But, this and Y2K was a non-issue as a result, but it required some serious dedication and some very strong attention that is not necessarily obvious to the average physicist currently, right?
Yeah, and an interesting example is with the Newtonian theory. The Newton theory was able to predict pretty well the functionment of the solar system with all the planets. And the first patch was made by Einstein with the relativity theory, explaining.
Olivia, I'm sorry, you're going to have to move closer to the mic. I'm getting lots of people saying
yeah.
they can't hear you.
All right.
Oh, okay.
Start over.
Yeah.
Can you hear him better now?
Yeah. Can
Well,
you? So I was saying an example of that. It's the Newton theory, which was with the gravity, which was able to predict the functionment of the solar system with all the orbital.
The functionment is a French word with an English accent. It would be the mechanics of our solar system.
Yeah. And the first patch to this theory was made by Einstein with the general relativity and with the prediction, for example, of the Mercury orbits. But we saw that expanding this nice model to the whole universe make evidence that the model wasn't enough with the some issue and they try to solve this issue, for example, with dark energy and dark matter.
Mhm. So just like with Newtonian earlier gravitational theory, Einstein patched it. And now when we use Einstein for the whole universe, we have issues where we're missing 96% of the mass. And the current patch is to invent a new kind of matter and a new kind of energy that is conveniently impossible to detect because it's dark. And I call that the dark ages of physics. You know, and it's a patch that's not very appealing, even to many physicists finally. You know, early on, everybody bought onto it. And because it sprung out a whole new industry. I mean, you got to think about physics is as well an industry. And if you have a theory that all of a sudden says we need to build, you know, billion-dollar instruments to detect dark matter and dark energy, well, you know, you get billions of dollars from governments to go and salt mines and, you know, build detectors, and it gives a lot of work to a whole lot of physicists, and so it's a good thing. And then, so because physics is an industry, it has a tendency to go in certain directions that have financial interest. Isn't that true?
Yeah, there is some kind of politics.
Yeah. And so we'll call it some kind of politics. And so basically, that can create distortion. But I mean, because of the failure in finding any dark matter particle anywhere at any time, any place in the universe we've looked, finally, in the last few years, physicists have been starting to think maybe we need a better theory than patching 96% the mass of the universe with dark matter and dark energy. Maybe the problem is not that we're missing mass. The problem is that the theory we're using is incomplete. And, you know, so people have been starting to look at ways. Now, we published papers on the cosmological constant, which is the constant that's describing the expansion of the universe and the mass of the universe and all this, and in which we use the holographic mass theory and show that we can account for all the mass of the universe, including what they call dark matter and dark energy, with our theory without needing, you know, to have some kind of fudge factor about some kind of matter that you can't detect. So basically we're showing that the equations are correct, and to put it like in a very sustained way, no, two French people trying to speak English.
Succinct.
Succinct. I can never say that. Succinct way. You know, the paper basically showed that if we apply the holographic mass solution, or straight up, you know, the Schwarzschild solution to Einstein field equation appropriately to the universe, that is, considering all of its mass, in the case of the Schwarzschild solution. In the case of the holographic mass solution, comes out normal. It comes out naturally from the equation. The universe obeys the condition of a black hole. When the universe is considered in the condition of a black hole, it has the correct mass, and that is because the quantum vacuum fluctuation of that black hole have to be considered. That is, the space in the universe is not empty, it's full of energy, and you have to consider that energy when you consider the mass of the universe. The whole equation of physics that describes the universe is explaining that to physicists. It's showing that to physicists, but they've not understood it yet, and they're starting to.
So Nassim, would you say that what you just described, that the energy that's contained in what's typically called the vacuum, the empty space, which is and as explained in module 3, that was removed from the premise of the whole theory in order to basically do away with the problem of infinities that kept showing up.
Exactly.
When you calculate the quantum potential and every point in space, it goes to infinity. And they're like, well, we can't do that. So let's get rid of that. And that became then the foundational premise that, well, we're not going to include that energy. Would you say that really that is the most essential shift from the modern physics model to the unified physics model?
Exactly. That's very well said. Basically, early on, when Einstein wrote relativity, there was a few experiments, Markuson and Marley experiment that, remove the concept of ether that was present before that as a result of Maxwell and others, that had understood that electromagnetic waves propagating in the universe must be, propagation of some medium. So space could not be empty if it was propagating waves. And so they had understood that space was full of an energy medium they had called the ether. And that is how Maxwell wrote his equations before they were linearized. And he wrote his equations to describe the electromagnetic field literally as vortices of the ether with little balls in it, with little smaller vortices in it, right? Rotating around. And he got the right answers. It gave all the right answer for the measurements we were making in laboratory. It was very precise. It was really good. It was a little more complex, but and so it was correct. But with the event of general relativity, they basically, and this has been a big problem in physics, is that there was a point in physics where it became acceptable to start doing conceptual models or mathematical conceptual models of things, assuming they were not things. So you basically use a thing in your equation, but you say it's nothing. It's just a thing. But it's not in the real world. It's just a thing I'm putting in my equation. And this is what space-time became. It was a thing, right, that they put in the equation. They said, wow, when space-time curves, it produced gravity. But don't worry about space-time. It's not a real thing, right? And the Michelson-Marley experiments kind of supported that view because it was a bad experiment, right? It was like an experiment that could not measure the ether. I mean, if they would have been really lucky, maybe they would have seen it. But the way the experiment was conducted, there's no way they could have measured the ether with that because it's fluctuating at the Planck scale, much smaller. It has viscosity, so that means that it's rotating on the same frame of reference as the planet, so they wouldn't see a difference at the surface of the planet. All this, and there was a lot of reasons, right? And
and now we have experiments showing that there is this ether.
Yes, there's many experiments
with the frame dragging and the
frame dragging. There's the Casimir effect, the dynamical Casimir effect, showing that the vacuum is not empty, but it got a new name. You see, so it all got convoluted. Now it's quantum vacuum fluctuations in quantum theory. But in relativity, it became space-time. So now those things got like separated because space-time was thought to be smooth and quantum theory thought to be granular. So they didn't agree with each other. And so everything became very, very convoluted. If people are interested, and can somebody make a note? We should add this link in the resource of that module, we should add the link of Frank Wilczek giving a talk called the reality of the materiality of the vacuum.
Yeah.
That
That's
is
a
an
good one.
excellent talk. It's by a Nobel Prize winner in physics. It's the first high-level physicist in the world that has the nerve to talk about the fact that we should have never removed the ether from theory, that Einstein was wrong to remove it, and that it took him 10 years, but he figured out that it was the wrong thing to do. But by the time he reversed it or tried to reverse it, nobody listened to it. They were happy to have a thing that's not a thing that they called space-time. So this whole thing became very problematic because space-time being a thing that's not a thing, that is, nothing in Einstein field theory explained what the heck it was. All of a sudden having quantum fluctuation shows up out of quantum field theory that was like showed that space-time at the quantum scale of the quantum scale, meaning very fine level, was full of energy. That freaked out everybody because it wasn't, like you said, just full of energy. The equation said there was infinite amount of energy in every point of space-time, which makes space-time warp to infinity in every point, which I happen to think it is. That's why it's all connected through wormholes. And so this whole thing became very problematic, has been completely distorted and cut into pieces and isolated from each other. And the result is that most people do not understand the relationship of these pieces together. So forget unifying them. And that's been the big issue.
So it's really been the component that does unify them was removed. That was removed, and from there on it basically became offshoots trying to go in some, in a direction that could reconnect without any binding theory to reconnect them all.
Yeah.
And then, so modern physics has basically kind of in that regard has created its own problems, we could say.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's created its own problems, and it detached from the reality of reality, meaning it detached, all of a sudden it became conceptual, and literally, like very famous physicist Richard Feynman, for instance, used to tell his student all the time, shut up and calculate. Like literally it became this idea that like you can just write math, and if the math adds up, you're fine, right? You don't need to understand, you don't have to try to make it like some kind of mechanical understanding of the universe, some
or
kind
experimental validation.
Well, no, experimental validation was is still present, is still there. Like if you say space-time is curving, and you make the equation and you calculate how much it curves in the presence of how much energy and mass, and you can verify that by the orbits of the planet, you say, okay, we're good. And nobody goes back and say, what the hell? I was gonna use the F word. What the hell is space-time, right? It's okay that it's just math floating in the middle of nowhere. You see what I'm saying? That is the issue. Right? It became acceptable, and especially with quantum theory and the double slit experiment, the Copenhagen interpretation, it became acceptable to just write mathematical models that have no relationship or context in reality, and say, well, if it gives the right answer, it doesn't matter. Which is what I said about last week. You can have the right answer with completely the wrong theory, you know, and you will really misunderstand the universe, right? Like, you know, like geocentric solar system, you can account for all the movements of the planet and have very high precision of where they're going to be in space and point them in the sky and say, you see, it's right there where I calculated would be. But your solar system looks like a bad hair day until you make it a heliocentric solar system. And then in that case, you know, everything becomes simple. You still have the same predictive power, but you got the right model, right? Which is actually not quite right, because the sun is moving and you're making spirals, which would be more right, you know?
Yeah, or it's incomplete, we could say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Correct.
So in that,
there lies the problem. It's not because you can make a measurement and say, well, I'm getting the right answer, that you have the right model. And certainly if your model has conceptual math, conceptual systems in it, like modeling system that cannot be tied to the mechanics of the universe, how valid is it? What is it telling you about the universe?
Yeah, and so that then leads into another aspect that's in module 3, which is looking at the theories of loop quantum gravity, string theory, which, you know, string theory especially just became a massively huge, and some say highly successful theory, without any experimental validation whatsoever, but
no
millions and dollars of funding.
Reality, yeah.
And so you're saying it became a conceptual path to investigating an idea, basically,
right?
And
which is valid, but if you forget that you've made models, or if you don't care that your models have anything to do with reality, which is really the case at this point, like people make models, they don't really care if it has any relationship to physics, like really physics,
the physical universe.
Yeah, the physical universe. Like so string theory is really the like the ultimate, you know, let's just calculate and hope that is going to lead us to unification. And so this massive effort of thousands and thousands of physicists, billions of dollars, you know, poured into this to find a unified field theory along that very specific direction, because the first idea is elegant, that space and time has teeny strings in it that are vibrating is not that far off.
Right, that's what I was going to ask about, yeah.
Yeah, it's not that far off. The ether theory, you know, it's not that far off the reality. But then it was written in conceptual math, very complex conceptual math that just went on mostly by mathematicians, you know, physicist mathematician, which is a field of physics that developed, you know, which all of a sudden, like, you know, just exploded into, excuse the terminology for the string theorists out there, insanity, you know. And then it just, you know, and what was the result? Not one experimental evidence anywhere, because you keep, like, the way it's written, there's no hope for experimental evidence, which is convenient, right? Their strings are too small, they're compactified in too small of a bit, and we can never get there with any experiment on the planet. And so we're just going to assume
can't be proven wrong or right.
Right. So we're just going to assume they're there. And then the answer of the theory, right? When you write an equation, hopefully you get one answer and the answer is correct, right? Hopefully that's going on. Or you get a bunch of answers and the answers are correct, right? I mean, if you're doing a class, you know, if you're doing a test in mathematics and you're writing a proof, and at the end of the proof, hopefully you get the right answer. Well, in this case, you know, when you get to the end of the proof, you get an answer which says, well, you know, there's approximately 10 to the 4,948 or approximately to the 5,000, 10 to the 5,000, which is a huge number, immense number, possibilities of how the strings are compactifying, right? So basically you get 10 to the 5, what did I say, 500? It's 5,000, right? About, yeah, about the 10 to the 5,000 possibilities. Is that correct? Yeah. The possibilities of how the answer can be structured. So this this whole thing becomes kind of a mess.
Is there anything within those theories that you would say has contributed to a greater understanding, or have they just gone too far and lost that? Like you said, at the foundation was a good idea.
It did. It contributed to the holographic principle. It's just that it took a really long turn. It confused a lot of people. It's still confusing a lot of people. And but eventually it led, Sutskin and others to formalize the holographic principle in a way, with de Hoof, in a way that, start to describe fluctuations of the vacuum on the surface of black holes. Now we were getting back towards sanity, towards something, so like string theory initial concept, I think, was elegant and had value. The math that it just went completely in a whole direction of like mathematical insanity. And then it came back to something that, is much more manageable. Like, a quarter of the surface of a black hole is equivalent to its entropy, which is like, oh, wow. Okay. Now, but you can't really attribute that to string theory. It's just that strings formalism could be used to output the holographic principle, but you don't need strings to do it.
Right, I see.
Yeah.
I'm
So
curious
there
to
was
ask.
some cool stuff, but
Right, but a lot of confusion as well.
Yeah, a lot of confusion.
I'm curious to ask Olivier, who has gone through deep academic study of physics, gotten his doctorate, really studying, and I don't know your background to say what specific fields, but I know you've gone through the full academic program and studied what we would call modern physics very deeply. And to then come into a sense that, well, there's something more, there's something that's not quite answering some of the big questions in all of this. And then finding Nassim's theory and your initial sense of making a transition, maybe from one framework of understanding to another, how that was for you, and how that came about. And maybe just move closer again to the mic so we can hear you very well.
Yeah. So from my perspective, I was first an applied physicist. So I wasn't dealing with all these complex equations, and because in applied physics, usually we use simple equations that we can solve and that we can verify experimentally. So I wasn't aware of all this issue with theoretical physics and this kind of stuff. And it was very interesting to look at them and see the history of it, because like Nassim said before, it's very interesting to look at the first ideas and why they wanted at some point to change their path and to go on a strange way, on a more complex way, just to bury their non-understanding of the physics of the reality. So it seems that when people doesn't understand what they are talking about, they want to make it very, very complex, so it looks like more smart, even it's not functioning. And string theory is, like Nassim said, it's a good example of that.
And how was it for you when you then came upon the Sims work and started investigating that? What did that tell
And
you?
yeah, with Nassim work, the really interesting thing is that you can start again imagining the mechanism of everything in your head, because it's like normal physics that you can experience in your daily life, but applied at each scale. So it's very, yeah, it's very easier to to imagine and to work with, because it's not that abstract.
Right, right. Yeah.
Mhm.
No, that's,
Well, as well, it resolves issues that are not resolved in.
Yeah. So you don't have all these paradoxes, and so it's way easier to work with.
Yeah. But it still took Olivier a good 3 years,
Yeah, it's been 4 years now.
4 years. Yeah.
Yeah, because the big challenging part is that you need to look at all the physics, and usually an astrophysicist don't look at quantum physics because it's another field, so it doesn't have to look at it, and it's kind of a relief because studying everything is kind of very challenging. So it has been a very bad habit for physicists to study only one thing because it's easier.
yes.
But you lose the overview, and the overview is like most of the time essential, especially when you want to understand precisely what's happening. And working with Nassim makes you oblige you to studying everything, to have the at every time the overview to understand the whole thing.
Yes. I had to do that over a period of 30 years, and so this is one of the issue is that the complexity of physics can take a lifetime to study one field, and to be able to study very wide like that all the field, you have to go really hard for a really long time to understand the details. But since I had done that, I was able to feed Olivier the abstract version, yes, which you were happy to get. And then Olivier was able to study it. In many cases, Olivier was like, no, it can't be like that. And then I would say, yes, it is. And then he would like go study it and then go, oh my God, it is like that. And, so it's been a great journey. And the great thing about Olivier is that he's genius at seeing mechanical functions or physics in his head, and then applying it to mathematics and to work out the math and see if the conceptual notion has some foundation if it adds up in the mathematics. And so for the last 4 years we've been going at it, and Olivier is very honest with his exploration, and so it's been adding up and adding up and adding up and looking good, and now we have something really, really powerful.
Yeah.
We're both blown away how well it adds up. I saw a comment go by where people were saying, well, you guys are not really going through the module, and it's kind of all over the place. Can you guys stick to the module? And it's like, oh, sorry. That's
I mean, that's not the purpose of these particular sessions, to go through the module specifically, which I said at the beginning. It's more just have an overview and get a sense of the reason that we include these modules in the program, sort of the premise of why it's important to understand something like the modern physics theory, so that when we get to the next module 4, which is about unified physics, when you get there, it's very helpful to understand some of the foundations of physics, at least conceptually. And for most of us, at most conceptually, like me, I'm not a technical person. It's more about getting the concepts and then carrying it forward into the program. And I thought maybe just for a minute, we'd bring William on as well. William, if you might come on and unmute yourself. Thanks. Yeah. William Brown is our resident biophysicist and has been also working with Nassim for many years. And William actually has a course called The Big Questions, and one of our elective programs that you can sign up for as well in the Residence Academy. And I thought, William, if you could just speak for just a few minutes about, in relation to modern physics and the idea of the big questions that have been unanswered for so long. In our course, we're really looking to help answer those questions. And in the theory, of course, that's happening quite a bit. So if you could just speak for just a few minutes about the importance of addressing the big questions in physics and how that relates to the problems in modern physics.
Yeah, so the Big Questions course is looking at what are arguably some of the biggest questions in science as a whole. And of course, that starts with physics, because as the basis, as the fundamental science, that's where some of the most elementary questions reside. So questions relating to cosmogenesis. Where did everything come from? How did it all start? Was there a beginning? Will there be an ending? Pretty big question. To questions of biology. How did life start? Where did living things come from? And then retrospectively, how does that play back into the mechanics and physics of the universe? Then what about consciousness? This property that living things seem to have. Again, big questions. What is consciousness? Where does consciousness come from? These are in science that have almost been taboo subjects. Subjects that you don't address. Kind of going back to that, just shut up and compute type myopic approach, but also in part because it seemed that they were questions that would lead to just inexplicable situations. They were just riddled with paradoxes. A good example of that is the fine-tuning problem. How is it that the universe appears just right for life? Given that everything should have just a underlying randomness, how do you get this amazing organizational synergy and complex ordering that is necessary for life? So these are all paradoxes in modern science, and particularly in modern physics. They don't seem to have any tractable approach to answer them. One of the things about Nassim's unified physics approach is that it resolves those paradoxes. In particular, it resolves those paradoxes at that fundamental level. If you're just in modern physics, if you're asking how did the universe begin, what is time, these don't have answers. But and we'll see this as we get into module 4, when you start to look at the concepts that are coming out of the unified physics, things like space memory, that begins to explain, okay, what is time? And you begin to find an approach to resolve problems like the fine-tuning problem. Because you find, well, okay, there's this structure and informational aspect of space itself. Maybe that is offering a non-random function to the mechanics of the universe, so that you can get this order and organizational synergy that increases over time. And you get in a universe that evolves and develops to form these complex arrangements of matter that we call life. And as well, questions related to the Big Bang, the cosmogenesis, the beginning of the universe, and what we're able to do with the unified physics approach is weave all of that together. And as Olivier and Nassim were saying, the beautiful thing about it is that it doesn't require this complexity that perhaps would be presumed that you need to explain these big questions. Because at the heart of it, it's simple and it's elegant, and really an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old can understand. So to build this complexity that you see, that is the universe, you can do that. That is accomplished because it's built on simple principles.
Yeah.
Even simple geometric foundational principles. And so, the Big Questions course is exploring that, and it's really, it's a continuation. It's taking that next step from module 3, module 4, and even module 6, as we'll see.
Yes. Yeah. Going deeply into some of the subjects covered in the main course. Mm-hmm. Thanks, William. Thanks for that overview. And yeah, you can see how it relates to the modern physics having, as we said earlier, basically gone into offshoots and removed that which allows it to all bind together into a unified theory. And when that's put back in, those big questions have a much greater chance of being answered, which is what's happening. So yeah, so it's a fantastic course, and it's one of the electives that you can choose to purchase and go into at any time in the academy.
Right.
It's probably a good idea to go through the Unified Science course first. And right, that's the free one that is available now. Do that first and then go into something like that course.
Yeah. And just to go back to the course a little bit, like, when we talk about, I was excited actually to write about Newton. Some of that module, actually, we have to give credit to Adam Apollo wrote a bunch of it. I rewrote a bunch of it, but basically, and it was great. It's just, I needed to be a little bit different because of the studies I've made, especially in the history of physics. That's not so well known. So if you've been educated in college on physics today, you might not know. But like, for instance, a great example is Newton. When people think about Newton, they think about Newton laws. They think about the source of the concepts of mechanics. So I just wanted to touch on this, very lightly, but I just wanted to touch on this, that like this concept, first of all, like if you actually read Newton's private writings, and if you look at the history, especially since his private notes were uncensored in the last decade, which are still not well known, that actually his personal notes were censored, and that they were like they were brought to the public, and that give the completely different picture of who Newton was, because everybody think about Newton, they think about mechanic physics, very reductionist physics, and so on. They think of him as the father of reductionist physics with Descartes and and Cartan, but basically this is just not the case. But not only that, is that people, when you say when I say this, I shock people. I say, okay, well, the universe is mostly just straight up mechanics. and people say, oh my God, you know, you just taken all the magic out of the universe. Like you just killed all my spiritual and aspiration. And, you know, like, I didn't think of you as a reductionist. Did you actually say that, you know? And it's funny because it's like, because mechanics doesn't mean that it's linear, doesn't mean that it's boring. Mechanics is actually completely nonlinear. It's one of the, like, spin is one of the hardest thing to describe in physics. It's very, very complex. Like, in fact, gyroscopic effects and Coriolis effect and gyroscopic effects have not been so well understood in mechanics. Everybody would think we know this stuff, like, you know, but there's problem with frame of reference. There's problem, like, and as well in charge, in energy mechanics. You know, like you have like things like monopolar generator and so on, that like you just spin a magnet, makes power, you know, like, you know, relative to what, you know, like, and so, you know, there's all kinds of things. But basically, mechanics doesn't mean it's boring. Mechanic means that actually, you know, if you don't understand something in the universe, and that leads to as well some of the interpretation later, and I'll get back to Newton, it doesn't mean that it's magic. It doesn't mean it's like quantum magic and you can just write math that makes quantum magic come out right, and that the universe is some kind of mess at the quantum level that's not understandable and you should just shut up and calculate. That is not the case, folks. You know, that was a departure that was horrible in physics when they agreed, okay, we're going to drop all mechanical system, and because we can't understand them, not because there was lots of evidence that there's no mechanical system. There's lots of evidence there's mechanical system, that angular momentum is really happening at the quantum level, that all these things. But instead, it's like, well, this is just so mind-boggling, I can't think about it, so I'm just going to write math that just bypass all this. And, you know, and so basically, you know, when you look at Newton was an alchemist. Newton was a very spiritual person. Newton, you know, actually in his writing, in his private writing, Newton had figured out that there was subatomic particles in the atom. He had figured out that these subatomic particles were singularities. He had the concepts. You know, he had, you know, he had something so much more powerful than what was published, which was literally little notes that his students found around his desk and his apartment, you know, which happened to be the laws of motions and, you know, the laws of conservation and so on. And, you know, that for him were just kind of approximation approach to get to somewhere more profound. And these notes got published and became, you know, but actually Newton was a much deeper thinker than all this, and to associate him with mechanical physics is just fundamentally wrong, like very, very fundamentally wrong. And it's really sad that he is portrayed like that in most history books, and certainly to students in colleges. And so there's magic is mechanics. And this is why, you know, this is why I've always said, you know, all these para everything phenomenon, you know, and spiritual concepts and all this are just physics we haven't understood. You know, the fact that people can have, you know, extrasensorial capability to remote view, for instance, something on the other side of the planet they've never been to, which has been completely supported and published in very good journals from experiments in laboratory. You know, the fact that people can do that, which is a fact because it's been measured, and published in peer-reviewed journals. Okay, although it appears like magic and very spiritual and it's wonderful, that the human mind can do that, or the human consciousness can do that, in the context of the mechanics of a unified view of physics, becomes understandable. That's what I mean by that. Like, it's the physics we haven't understood, is because, like, if your physics equation end up telling you that every point in space is connected through micro wormholes, and then information is moving across the universe, across these wormholes, and it's making the mass of everything you see, well, all of a sudden, it makes sense that since you're made out of these things we call atoms that are part of the micro network wormhole of the universe, you have access to information that's non-local. So all of a sudden, something that looks magical becomes understandable in physics. And that's really important. That's what Newton was looking for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a mechanism to something like remote viewing, and it makes sense. Yeah, or healing, and it makes sense that, like you said, these kinds of phenomena have been shown to be true and well proven, and published papers about it. And yet, without a foundational theory to explain what's the mechanism for that, and so it's often just sidelined as a scientific field, because without a foundational theory and a mechanism, it's pseudoscience or whatever it gets labeled. And
exactly
what's happening now, and that's part of the problem with modern physics, is that there is no mechanism you could point to in that theory, because of the fact that they removed the idea of space being full and connected and made it an empty vacuum. And so without that, again, that unifying component, there's no mechanism, there's no way to correlate such phenomena in that kind of a model.
Yeah, you don't even have, exactly, in that context, you don't even have a mechanism for, as William was describing, for complex life to emerge,
exactly.
For systems to,
let alone that.
Yeah, forget spiritual, events like remote healing. You don't have a mechanism for one human being to even exist, or even things that are well known and well measured. For instance, not like remote viewing wasn't well measured, but for instance, people talk about the placebo effect. Placebo effect. People talk about it. Oh yeah, that's just a placebo effect. Oh yeah, that's just a placebo effect. Like, if it's a normal thing. Like, well, wait a minute. First of all, that's like almost 30. And, correct me if I'm wrong, William, like, I think it's 30 to 50% can be the placebo effect. Even in surgery, placebo effect, where they just open you, they don't do anything, they close you up and you're good.
It's extremely non-trivial. It's like you have to control for the placebo effect, the fact that people will heal themselves.
Right. And so, of course, so people say, oh yeah, there's a placebo effect. It's accepted by all the mainstream. It's accepted by all, because you can't avoid it, because it's not like a 0.1% thing. It's a huge amount, 30 to 50% of people can self-heal. Well, in the context of a random universe with no organizing structure, with no, field interaction, with like where you're just in space as like some kind of space microbe that involves some kind of miracle on this planet, like and in a random universe that has no, organization. Well, of course, like, how is your consciousness all of a sudden, because you got given a sugar pill telling you it's going to heal you, how did it get rid of your cancer, right? Like, how did that actually happen, right? But people ignore that question because they don't have a context. But in the context of a unified view, of course, every atom is an information, network that's extracting. The holographic mass solution give all the correct answer. I just want to say it gives the correct answer. It's not like string theory where it can't be proven. It has been measured now, like the prediction of the radius of the proton is a prediction that was done by the theory, that was measured in an accelerator, and that was confirmed, and that is now the co-data value for the radius of the proton. And so, you know, these kind of things, like all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, so now, you know, since your body is actually an information flow of the quantum field oscillator, well, you know, if you decide in that information flow that your cells are supposed to do something else than what they're doing, there's a good chance they're going to do it. And, you know, you might be absolutely unconscious that you're doing it, but because you were told there is this pill that it's going to heal you, guess what? The material world responded to it. And so that's a whole other different.
Yeah, we can even delve into that a little bit more next week. And I think in module 6 it goes into the information network, the space memory network aspect, and we can delve into that a bit more there.
It's important not just for the physicists or the mainstream or the doctors or whatever. It's important for the spiritual community as well, because the tendency is to think, well, it's some kind of spiritual thing that has nothing to do with reality, that has nothing to do with physics, and that's just as bad. Now you've made it this, you know, this is another separation. Oh, this is spirituality. It has nothing to do with the physical world. And then the other guys on the other side is like, oh, this is all physical world. It has nothing to do with like consciousness or spirituality or something. And it's just one thing. It's just
basically both fingers are pointing at the other, saying it's an illusion.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. And that doesn't get you very far. It's really, really sad.
There's still something going on, even though it fundamentally, yes, it may be an illusion, but there's still something real happening right now.
Exactly.
We are engaged in it. So let's do some questions, Nassim.
Okay.
I think just in the spirit of the module 3 modern physics subject matter, there's one from someone named Nuno Macado asking for you to explain the difference between the Copenhagen interpretation and your point of view, your theory. And so if you could just nutshell a little explanation of what the Copenhagen interpretation is, and maybe the most important parts that then informed modern physics from there, and then how the unified physics theory is addressing some of those, some of the issues that came from that.
Okay, so you know, there is a very so it's a little bit of a long story. I'll try to make it short, but basically, in quantum theory, there was an experiment that was done in which, you know, particles are shot at a slit, and you know, it came from earlier experiments as well, in which they were trying to understand particle and wave interaction and all this stuff. And basically, you know, when they shot the particles at the slit, they got one result on the backboard, on the detector that was receiving the particles, which was like dots. And then when they got, you know, two slits there, and the slits cannot just be random slits, they have to be in the right proportion and the right dimension and all this, you know. It's not an easy experiment to make. But then, you know, the result is that all of a sudden, instead of getting, you know, the particles on the detector in the back, they would get like waveforms, right? They would get interference pattern type of structures that look like waveforms. And they were basically confused. It's like, well, we're shooting particles. How are we getting waveforms? And, you know, they couldn't understand, like, all of a sudden the way the particle was like a particle and a wave. It appeared that like somehow the particle became superposed, or it became separate or dual, and went through two slits and interact with itself to make waves on the other side. And it was like, oh my God, how is this possible? The particles are wave and particles at the same time. This was a very, very critical moment in this history. It was, part of what happened in Copenhagen. I don't know what they were taking, but what happened, whatever they were taking, it was not good stuff, right? Because what happened is that, they eventually said, well, we're going to abandon mechanical concepts of particles and waves in quantum scale. And we're going to just say their probability relationship. And this is what led to this whole quantum magic thing. Meanwhile, and there's another part of the experiment where they would put a detector to try to figure out which slit the particle went through, trying to catch it, and then if the measuring device they put in was in the right proportion to the slit, they had this other result where it basically returned to dots, and like so then they say, oh my God, when we measure, it changes the outcome. And so they're even more lost, like, oh my God, how can that be? And this led to the really sad moment in physics where physical models were abandoned, and they said, okay, we can't deal with this, trying to understand its mechanics. It's not mechanical. It's got to be some kind of magic. And, we can only write like, basically statistical approximation of what goes on. And particles can be particles and waves at the same time, which led to the statement from Feynman, don't ask questions, just calculate. And basically they were able to write mechanical models that kind of worked. I mean, they work, they give the correct answer, but it didn't tell you how a particle is a particle and a wave at the same time, which led to this idea that quantum world is so different from the classical world. In physics, classical world is the larger world, right? That you can't understand it. It's completely different, and it's magical down there. And you shouldn't try to like think of the quantum world anywhere close to your reality every day. Yet, the piece that's missing there is that all of reality in your large world, in your classical world, is made of quantum things. So where does it stop becoming magical and starts becoming just linear mechanics? Like, it's just complete insanity, folks. It's sad. It's so crazy. And it led to like literally like almost like how do you call it, a personality disorder? A dual personality problem. And so basically, but all this time there was this great physicist that was well known at the time, French physicist Duboglier, that was there, that was saying, hey, wait a minute, I can solve this with fluid dynamics. And because he was an expert in wave dispersion and wave propagation. And he tried to talk to Einstein. He did talk to Einstein and others, but they didn't like the idea because it would have brought the ether back. So they went against it because he showed, and then eventually Bohm, so the Broglie and Bohm effect and so on, it eventually called pilot wave theory, where they showed that actually you can resolve the double slit experiment completely just using fluids. And eventually, I independently, so the question is, how does it relate to the theory? I independently, in my van 30 years ago, figured out, wait a minute, I can solve the double slit experiment with wave in the fluid. But I had no way to do the experiment. Eventually the experiment was done, and I didn't know that the Broglie had resolved it. I thought I had come up with it. And then I realized I was like, I had got beat by, a few hundred years. No, 75 years or whatever it was. But basically, they took a back of fluid, silicone liquid, and they put little silicone beads on it and 2 slits and shot the beads, and they got all the effects, because guess what? When a particle is moving, that's how I figured it out in my event. When a particle is moving, you can assume it's in the vacuums of that space is empty and it's not having anything to do with the particle, or that the ether is being affected, and maybe the particle itself is made out of the ether. And so basically, just like a boat going on the ocean, when it moves, it makes waves. So of course it's a particle and a wave at the same time, right? It makes waves when it moves in the ether. And then, of course, the waves go through the second slit, interferes with the particle, make waves on the backboard. Like all of a sudden makes sense. When you put an instrument to measure it, the instrument makes wave, interferes with the waves that the particle are making, and makes a third effect. All of a sudden, everything is affecting everything because we're all bathing in the same field. This is called pilot wave theory, and you can actually go to YouTube and see some of these experiments. They were able to output, quantum tunneling. They were like all the things we see from the double slit experiment, you can replicate with fluids, showing that basically the particle is moving in a field. And, in the context of the unified view of physics, that field is the source of matter, forces, and energy that we see in every day, and including eventually, like William was saying, the construction of biological system and consciousness. So it's awesome that, like, you just have to add the field in, and then you resolve the equations that are already there, and all of a sudden it's like, wow, look at that. It gives all the right answers. And all of a sudden you get rid of magic in physics, which should not be there, right? And you understand the true mechanics of creation and ourselves.
Relating to the pilot wave theory, there's a question regarding how do you explain the hidden variables? And so, and I think that, your approach addresses this in part because you do have non-local connections via that infinite curvature of space-time, those wormhole connections, but also even Bohm's pilot wave theory, it has non-locality at a global scale, and so you can still have hidden variables. But how do you explain the hidden variables?
Yeah, you mean by the non-locality, interaction of particle and so on?
Yeah, because you've got Bell's theorem.
Yeah.
That, is supposed to show that these quantum interactions
Correct.
Can't be explained by any hidden variables, which I guess in a sense means that your particle didn't have a property until it was measured, or
right,
of that nature.
Right, exactly. So basically, the Schrödinger cat in the box, that is alive and dead at the same time in superposition. This is where the Copenhagen interpretation leads to, is like all of a sudden this because you have something that's nonlinear, that is producing, that's showing that information is non-local. The tendency has been to think that because we can't figure it out locally, that it actually doesn't exist until it is measured locally. It's like, and there's a famous thing from Einstein, because Einstein thought that was a whole bunch of baloney, and he was right. But because he was walking with a physicist, and I can't remember who it was. I can't remember. It was a physicist or a mathematician in the gardens of Princeton, and he said, so if I understand this right, do you really believe that if you don't turn around to look at the moon, it's not there, right? It's like, oh no, of course not. There's a problem there. It's not like things don't exist if you don't observe them. The universe is not human centric. It doesn't require the human to make a measurement in order to come to existence. It doesn't really give a shit if the humans are around. Consciousness is not localized in humans. There's consciousness everywhere. If the cat is in the box and it's in state of superposition, in which is alive and dead until you open the box and observe its state, well, guess what? What happened to the flea? What is the observation of the flea on the cat irrelevant? What about the microbes in the box? What about their observation? Is that irrelevant? There's all sorts of problems with the frame of reference. But guess what? You can still, and I'm not saying, I'm being crass a little bit. It just, it's kind of drives me crazy. But it's just that, like, if you think about it clearly, you can have a fluid that has, in the case of a superfluid that has, for instance, interaction at a distance. If you have, wormhole interaction, black hole interaction, singularity, meaning that each part of the fluid is singular. It has curvature towards infinity, towards singularity in each point. So you have a fluid, but it's not, well, it's actually like a normal fluid, because the normal fluid is made of atoms which have, like, you can't really divide it. But basically what I'm saying is not because it's in a fluid dynamics function that it has, all of a sudden it loses, those variables that we have been able to measure, which has to do with entanglement and, spooky action at a distance, so you can have both. You can have, the fact that space is full of this energy, and the fact that this energy is made of singularities that have, non-local interaction. That is, they're connected through wormhole across the whole grid, meaning that the whole grid is connected. This is why our equation with the standard model of quantum physics give somewhat the right answer, because it appears like the information is unknown until it's observed. It's not that. It's just that the interaction of the information locally is non-local across the whole thing, right? Across the whole universe, across the whole multiverse. And because you can't compute that, to you, it looks like it just appeared non-locally from random function, but actually it's highly coordinated across the whole. The flea observation inside the box is considered by the whole thing. The whole thing is, is computing reality continuously as the whole. And because we can't measure that, we can't compute that. It appears to us to be random and local,
Great. I think that covered the subject.
It's a deep subject.
It's a deep subject for sure, and it did cover it. And it's, you can see there's a direct relationship between a concept that couldn't be explained, or an observation, I should say, that couldn't be explained in a model that had limitations just inherent in it, that then became conceptualized in an abstract way and persisted for a long time.
Right.
And then when you look at it from another perspective that includes a field dynamic that would exhibit the same kind of behavior, and suddenly it makes sense. And like Olivier said, it's all much simpler when you actually have a perspective, a frame of reference that allows it to make sense. Whereas the prior interpretation which was an interpretation, literally, did not have that. So
Right.
yeah. Well, let's see. Olivier, did you see any questions? I don't know if you're looking at questions as well. Did you see any that you'd like to have Nassim answer? Or there's so many questions here.
It has implications, you know, even for consciousness. And like when you think of yourself, you know, to bring it back to people, when you think, you know, my consciousness is in my brain and it's, you know, it's inside me and nothing outside of me is, you know, and what's inside me, well, what's inside you is 99.9999999% space, you know. What you're calling you is a point, it, 0.000000000 of something, right? And that something, when you look closely, it's an electrostatic field that's oscillating, that we call a particle, like a proton or electron. And so basically, when you realize that that thing is just a field that you're interacting with, and it's non-local, oh my God, you can have a lot of fun. You can have a lot of fun, you know. Olivier, you found some good questions?
Yeah, there are some questions about the space memory network and the seaworld that now we can
Talk about
in physics.
the C word. Okay. Yeah, the space. I mean, actually, William can talk about that as well at length. But yeah,
we'll go into that more when we talk about module 6, I believe.
You know what's very much related to that, and I've seen a couple of questions, is the holographic physics. You know, so you're using this a holographic approach, and you're outputting solutions to quantum gravity. But you know, on the one hand, there's a little bit of confusion. What is holographic physics? What does that mean? You know, I think that especially coming from the mainstream, it gets confounded with this idea of that the universe is really two-dimensional and we're projections of that, and that's certainly not really the approach you're taking. Your holographic approach is more the information content of a surface horizon, and also holographic properties like the whole is contained in every one point. But you know, how is your holographic approach even different from kind of that mainstream idea?
Yeah,
physics.
That's a good question, because you know that's the problem you run into is that the holographic principle, as you know, became popular about 15 years ago or 12 years ago or something, when Hawking lost the bet with Sudskin, and De Hoof and those guys, that you know, that information could be lost in a black hole. It was thought that information that fell into a black hole was lost, and you know that it basically violated the laws of quantum physics that said that no information could be lost, meaning that it had to be conserved. And you know, so the quantum physicists start to you know, started a war with you know, Hawking, which was an astrophysicist, and you know, and there was this big debate. It was a nice kind of war. Nobody shot at each other, or luckily. But basically, eventually, and I mentioned earlier, from, you know, string theory that, you know, approaches and all this, and from what was done by Bekenstein earlier, and then eventually De Hoof and all this, the idea that there's a fundamental bit of information at the quantum scale, at the Planck scale, that that information, when it falls into a black hole, actually is recorded on the surface of that black hole as a holographic bit of information about everything that has gone into that black hole, and so that the information is not lost. And then, so that was great, because it was actually a sensitive, like a first start to relating real physics, right? Which is the physics of thermodynamics, because it gives the correct answer for the entropy of a black hole, for the temperature of a black hole, right? So to information theory and starting to think about the Planck field, right, as being something that produces real effects, right? That it's not just a kind of crazy thing that's in quantum field theory and that just like you can ignore it. It actually may, so it was really important. But the problem is that it was written in two-dimensional physics, which is, again, we've made models a very long time ago, not by the same guy, that, you know, we write physics on Cartesian planes and two-dimensional planes and all this, and then we forgot we did it. So guess what? The result is that physicists started thinking, oh my God, maybe the universe, the 3D universe, as if there was anything else, right? Maybe the 3D universe is the result of some 2D surface projecting a holographic set of information that makes up our universe. And this made headlines. You probably saw it on the cover of magazine. Is our universe a holographic universe projection of a 2D surface and all this stuff, as if there was such a thing as a 2D surface. Even in the theory itself, that surface would have to have the thickness of a Planck oscillator. It would not be. So, you know, and there's no such thing in the universe as a two-dimensional plane. So, you know, I was well on my way to coming to similar conclusion, but in geometry. And so of course, you know, I was exploring, I had written already what I call the Schwarzschild proton solution. And I had considered inside the proton all the Planck vacuum interaction of the field, right? I had clearly put the ether back in, you know, understood that quantum field theory and vacuum fluctuation was the ether. And I had put that back into the proton, and I had got the right answer for the strong force, for the force that the proton acts on each other and all this. And I was very excited. And then I'm like, wait a minute, they're missing the volume. So I said, okay, well, you know, I was missing something in the Schwarzschild solution, which was as well the rest mass of the proton. It was outputting the strong force, but not the rest mass of the proton. And so I was like, oh, and you know, I mean, this took years of working and this stuff. And then eventually I realized, wait, you know, it turns out, I mean, after all the physics I wrote, it turned out that like the volume, if I had Olivier then, I might have found it earlier, but it turned out that the volume of the Planck oscillators relative to this surface, so how much information is able to go across the surface, is more, you know, produces the mass of the system. And, you know, I'm like, wow, it gives the right answer for black holes. It didn't give the right answer for protons. And then all these constants emerge, and now we're like scaling it to the whole thing. And so that's the difference. It's like, I didn't go for a 2D surface. I stayed into the reality of our universe.
Right. Yes, that's an important aspect. And that's a good example, I think, of what we would refer to as the shift of perspective and frame of reference from what has traditionally been the approach of modern physics, as we call it, and making the shift to a model that can be more unified, or be unified, not even more, but be unified. So yeah, I think we just have a few more minutes, Nassim, and
we can take a few more questions, maybe.
Well,
one more.
One more. I was thinking if you would be okay with this one. Our friend Christiana Eltrayan was asking, you know, how do you see the world in 20 years? And I think from the perspective of what we're discussing today, we've had a history of science and physics and the applications of physics that have informed our current state of the world and progressed us to this point. And we're really looking at and talking about a real paradigm shift of understanding, as we talked about in the last two sessions, you know, the worldview shift, the scientific shift of understanding that is informing our science now and will and is informing our technologies and the applications of that science. And so if you would just take a few minutes to say, okay, well, with that in mind, making that sort of a shift right now in our world, what might that look like in the next 20 years?
Well, we're making that shift, and you know, part of what's going on in the world right now is actually helping us make that shift. It's really important. It's kind of breaking down some of the structures that needed to be broken down to expose some of the stuff that's going on in the world that's not necessarily serving us. And you know, it's very important. And as well, some of the experiments that are being done by inventors are reemerging as well. What it looks like for the next 20 years is remarkable. This will, you know, if it's delivered on time to the public, this will, you know, and is becoming the mainstream very quickly. And what it will do is that it will change our relationship to the universe very fundamentally, change our relationship to technology, to energy. You know, in that module, we talk about E equals mc squared. Well, m is unknown in that equation. That means that E is unknown. We don't know why the speed of light is going to the speed of light. All these things start to be understood in the holographic mass solution and the unified view of physics. And then all of a sudden, you understand where energy comes from. It comes from that fundamental field, you know, of information, that ether. Now it becomes clear how to engineer devices to extract energy from that field. All of a sudden, you align your world and you align your technology to the fundamental mechanics of creation. All of a sudden, like, you're working with nature instead of working against nature. And that just changes everything from like energy production. All of a sudden, you have a non-polluting source of energy anywhere you are in the universe. You have an infinite amount of it. You don't need resources. You don't need to burn coal. You don't need to collide atoms. You don't need to, like, you know, you just extract it from the structure of space. You have gravitational control. You're able to fly off the surface of your planet, live in the universe wherever you want. You can live in the solar system. You can live in the galaxy. I mean, you know, all of a sudden, your world completely transformed. This is one of the largest transformation. You know, the first large transformation our world saw technologically is we learned about electromagnetic fields and learned how to control them, right? Everything you have today is based on this, right? And then, you know, now this next step is we're learning what gravity truly is, right? Which is, Einstein was correct, it's curvature of space-time. However, space-time is not some, you know, theoretical model of something. It's actually a thing. It's called the vacuum fluctuation or the ether, whichever you want to call it. And when it curves, it's because there's something spinning. That's what we call mass. We actually have now these mathematics, and then and when we apply them, all of a sudden now we have control over gravity. We're no longer stuck to our planet. We have access to almost infinite amount of resources because we can go around the solar system, the galaxy, to all this. We have infinite amount of energy. Our world is completely different. And it becomes very small very quickly, right? And the unification of humanity becomes very obvious, right? Because all of a sudden, viewed from space, it's not hard to see that there's not really any line dividing all of the continents, you know, and that, you know, we're a little teeny ball in space flying with a bunch of microbes on it we call people. And, you know, that, and so the perspective, the change of consciousness, everything changed. Everything changed fundamentally. And so the next 20 years are going to be remarkable. I'm so happy to be here to experience it.
Well, we're happy you're here too, because you're driving a lot of that that happens. So it's a good thing. But yeah,
Standing on
and
the shoulders of giants.
the really profound thing you're saying relative to Christiana's question is we're talking about in the next 20 years, and it's not a far-fetched statement at all, because the theory is becoming clearer every day. It's sensible, and then it's applicable because it's related to the mechanics of the universe. And also we know that numerous technologies have been developed and are being developed for the energy extraction and for gravity control, and when we make those kinds of shifts, literally every aspect of the human experience changes. When you have the ability to extract energy from space in an unlimited abundance, then the idea of what an economy is, an economic model, completely changes, because it's no longer based on scarcity and competition and win-lose. And so every aspect changes, and it's at hand now. And there's a little bit of a wrestling match still going on in the dynamics of the human family here as to how it's going to go. And yet we know, and I feel confident that it's actually going to make a shift. And when it does, it'll happen very quickly. And like we even have seen with everybody not driving cars, whole cities are becoming free of the pollution in a matter of a week. And so when you obsolete the burning of fossil fuels, which is already possible, just electric vehicles and the advancement of battery technologies solves that problem. Of course, you have to generate the electricity, and then we have the technologies that will solve that problem as well. Then the environment will very quickly restabilize and balance. And like you said, we'll come into a harmony with nature, and it will happen in the blink of an eye from an evolutionary perspective.
Exactly. And people need to know all that we need is already there. Like the knowledge, the technology, all this stuff, it's already there. Which like it's emerging. It's been emerging. People are saying, well, you've been saying this for a while. Like, yeah, well, considering the evolutionary perspective of a galaxy, it's not been that long that we are, that, and so we had to overcome a lot to get this kind of technology out, and it's on its way. And actually, there's a great opportunity now because there's a huge transformation happening around the planet. And it can only come out when the consciousness and the awareness and the information flow of the vacuum field is in the right place for the social structure, the morphogenetic field of the planet to emerge. So every one of you is a participant in making that possible.
Yeah, and allowed to flow freely through the system. Well, that's a great way to celebrate Earth Day today with that perspective. And that's probably the most great gift we can give to our planet here and to each other and nature and on beyond out into the universe, is making that shift. And really, that's going to be what fulfills the vision of Earth Day that was started 50 years ago today.
Wow.
So great celebration. I also wanted to just say before we close that the French language version of the Unified Science program is now online, and Olivier is heading up that study, and we'll be offering these kinds of sessions, I think on a monthly basis as well. And tomorrow, actually, at the same time, 12 noon Pacific time, is the first of these kinds of sessions to introduce the program for 6 weeks in French. And so that's really exciting for all of us, and especially for the French-speaking community out and around the world. And tomorrow I'll be a guest on that first session. So I'm looking forward to that with Olivier. And we'll be here again next week for the next module, which is module 4, the big one, unified physics. This is where we really go into what we were talking about. When you understand the nature of the field and you include that which unifies it, what comes out of it. And so that's what that module really goes into. So look forward to that for next week. And in the meantime, everybody stay safe, stay well, take good care of each other, stay in your hearts, stay in your compassion, really be, careful in how we're relating with each other, because it's a very stressful time in many ways. And it's important to maintain our sense of balance and really this kind of optimism that we're experiencing here today. It really helps us a lot. So thank you, Nassim and Olivier and William and Penny and Jamie and everybody for coming here today and joining us in this session. And we'll look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you, everybody. It's great. Happy Earth Day. And until next week, may the vacuum be with you.
As always.
As always. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.